Welcome to Godless and Grounded.
When you open a book and read about a God who is described as the definition of love and mercy, you usually expect a story about healing or forgiveness. But when you turn to Genesis chapter 7, you run headfirst into a story that feels like it belongs in a completely different genre. We are talking about the Great Flood. For most people, this is a childhood story with a wooden boat and pairs of giraffes poking their heads out of a window. But if you actually sit down and look at the text through a logical and historical lens, the cozy nursery rhyme vibe disappears instantly. You are left with a massive contradiction that has puzzled philosophers and skeptics for centuries. How does an all-powerful, all-knowing, and infinitely merciful being decide that the best way to fix a problem is to drown almost everything that breathes? To understand why this story is so jarring, we have to look at what was happening on Earth according to the text. It says the world was filled with violence. Now, if you are a creator and your creation is broken, your first instinct is usually to fix it. If you build a computer and it gets a virus, you run an antivirus program. You don't take a sledgehammer to the motherboard and throw it in a lake. But in Genesis 7, the solution is total destruction. This brings us to our first major logical hurdle, the concept of divine omniscience. If God knew from the beginning that humanity would turn out this way, why let it get to that point? If you are an architect and you know the bridge you are building will collapse in 10 years, you are considered negligent if you build it anyway. That doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like an ultimatum. Let's talk about the logistics for a second, because that is where the mercy part gets really strained. We are told Noah was given specific instructions to build an ark. For decades, he's building this massive ship in the middle of nowhere. Think about the psychological impact on the people around him. If God is truly merciful, why was the warning so cryptic? Why wasn't there a clear, undeniable sign that change was needed? Instead, the story presents a God who closes the door of the ark and lets the rain fall. Imagine being a person living at that time. Maybe you weren't a murderer or a giant. Maybe you were just a mother trying to feed your kids, or a person who didn't believe the old man building a boat in the desert was sane. The screams of the drowning aren't usually mentioned in Sunday school, but they are a logical necessity of this story. A merciful being would surely find a way to partition the evil from the innocent, without killing the toddlers, the infants, and the animals who had no concept of sin or violence. From a philosophical standpoint, this is often called the problem of evil, but with a twist. Usually we ask why God allows evil to happen. In Genesis 7, the question is why God uses a greater evil, death, and destruction to stop a lesser evil. If you have the power to change a human heart or to educate a population, using a natural disaster as a reset button seems like a failure of imagination. It's the ultimate might makes right argument. It suggests that because God is the creator, he has the moral authority to destroy. But in any other context, we wouldn't call that mercy. If a father kills his children because they aren't behaving, we don't call him a just judge. We call him a monster. Now, let's look at the historical context. The story of a great flood isn't unique to the Bible. You find it in the Epic of Gilgamesh with Utnapishtim, and you find it in various Mesopotamian myths. In those older stories, the gods are often portrayed as fickle, annoyed by the noise of humans, or acting on a whim. The writers of Genesis tried to flip this by saying, "No, our God didn't do it because he was annoyed. He did it because he is holy." But this creates a bigger problem. By trying to make God moral in his destruction, it makes the violence feel calculated. It's no longer an accident or a divine temper tantrum. It's a legal sentence. But can a death sentence for an entire planet ever be considered merciful? Even the animals are caught in the crossfire. Why did the kittens and the puppies have to die? They didn't contribute to the wickedness of man. This is where the argument of total depravity usually comes in, but it fails under simple logic. If the environment was the problem, God could have changed the environment. If the biology was the problem, he could have adjusted the biology. Using a flood is the most inefficient way to solve a spiritual problem. It's like trying to perform heart surgery with a hand grenade. Then there is the aftermath. After the water recedes, God puts a rainbow in the sky as a promise never to do it again. If the flood was a perfect solution, why did the world become wicked again almost immediately? This proves that the violent method didn't actually work. It didn't fix the human condition. It just paused it. Let's dive deeper into the idea of God's regret. This is a huge red flag for the idea of an unchanging, all-knowing deity. Regret implies you didn't know how something was going to turn out. It implies you made a mistake. If God can make a mistake, then he isn't the perfect being theology claims he is. And if the flood was a reaction to a mistake, then the victims of the flood died because of a divine error. That isn't just a theological problem. It's a moral catastrophe. It turns the Creator into an experimental scientist who discards his lab results when they don't go his way. The story of Genesis 7 is a foundational myth used to explain the world's harshness and the need for obedience. But when you strip away the religious reverence, you are left with a story about a massive ecological disaster attributed to a deity who chose the most painful path possible. We value mercy because it's about restraint. It's about not using your full power to crush someone even when you think they deserve it. But the flood is the opposite of restraint. It is the full application of power. There is also the argument that the flood was a necessary cleansing to save a small remnant of good people. But again, this assumes that an all-powerful being was forced into a corner. Was God so limited that he couldn't protect Noah and his family while simply making the evil people disappear? Why the slow, terrifying rise of water? Why 40 days of darkness and chaos? A truly merciful being would surely prioritize the minimization of suffering. The flood, by its very nature, maximizes suffering. It is a slow, cold, and terrifying way to die. We see this same pattern in modern history when we talk about collateral damage. We criticize leaders who are willing to sacrifice thousands of innocent lives to kill a few bad actors. Yet in the theological framework, we are expected to praise God for doing exactly that on a global scale. It's a double standard that only works if you stop asking questions. When we look at the story from a purely biological and environmental perspective, the merciful label becomes even harder to justify. Think about the sheer scale of the ecological destruction. It wasn't just humans who were wiped out. It was every ecosystem, every plant, and every non-aquatic creature on the planet. If the goal was to punish sin, why destroy the coral reefs, the forests, and the insects? This is like a gardener burning down his entire forest because he found a few weeds in one corner. From a scientific viewpoint, the recovery of life from such an event would require a series of miracles so constant that the natural laws of the world would have to be suspended entirely. For an audience that values evidence and logic, this presents a God who isn't working with his creation, but against it. It paints a picture of a deity who is willing to trash the entire laboratory because one experiment didn't yield the desired results, showing a total lack of regard for the intrinsic value of the life he supposedly spent days meticulously designing. Furthermore, we have to consider the psychological impact on the survivors. Noah and his family were tasked with watching the entire world disappear. If you were the only 8 people left alive, knowing that everyone you ever knew, your neighbors, your distant relatives, the people who sold you grain had been killed by the being you worship, that isn't a gift of life, it's a lifetime of trauma. A merciful God, by definition, would care about the mental and emotional well-being of his followers. Yet, the story ends with Noah in a state of total collapse, getting drunk and cursing his own family. This is the peace that follows the violent method. It shows that violence, even when labeled as divine justice, only breeds more brokenness. It suggests that the trauma of the flood was so great that it actually corrupted the righteous family that was meant to start the world over. Then there is the issue of the standard of goodness that this story sets for humanity. Religion often claims that humans get their morality from God. But if God's primary way of dealing with a massive societal problem is total annihilation, what does that teach us? Throughout history, people have used the wrath of God as a template for their own violence, justifying crusades, inquisitions, and various forms of cleansing because they believe they are acting like the God of Genesis. By choosing a violent flood over a peaceful transformation, the story of Genesis 7 presents a deity that operates on the same primitive level of power over persuasion that we see in the worst parts of human history. It leaves us with a God who is merciful in words, but terrifyingly efficient in destruction. A contradiction that remains one of the biggest sticking points for anyone trying to reconcile a loving creator with the world described in ancient texts. To continue this deep dive into the narrative of Genesis 7, we have to address the sheer physical and logistical impossibility of the event, because for a logical mind, the how is just as important as the why. If we are told that a merciful God chose a violent method, we have to look at the collateral damage inherent in that method. Imagine the sheer volume of water required to cover the highest mountains. We are talking about billions of cubic miles of water appearing and then disappearing. Where did it go? If it's still here, we'd be under it. If it's gone, where did it retreat to? When you look at the geological record, you don't see a single uniform layer of flood sediment across the entire globe. Instead, you see millions of years of slow, incremental changes. The violent method described isn't just a moral problem, it is a scientific fantasy. If a god has to break every single law of physics he created just to drown a population he also created, it suggests a level of divine chaos rather than divine order. It's like a programmer having to delete the entire operating system and melt the hardware just to close one buggy application. Let's talk about the animals again, but from a perspective of suffering. It often glosses over the unclean animals, the ones that didn't make the cut for the bigger groups. Think about the millions of species of insects, most of which can't survive underwater for over a year. Think about the freshwater fish that would die in salt water. The merciful God of this story isn't just killing the wicked humans. He is effectively ending the lives of billions of sentient creatures who have no concept of morality. If a human caused an oil spill that killed 1,000 birds, we would call it an environmental crime. Yet, the flood is presented as a holy act. This creates a massive logical blind spot in theology. It's a message that says, life is sacred, unless I'm frustrated with it. In Genesis 7, he lets them come back together. But why the drama? If you are a being that can speak a universe into existence, you can certainly unspeak a problem. The choice to use a physical, violent, and agonizingly slow process like drowning reveals something about the character being portrayed. They do what is necessary as quietly and painlessly as possible. The flood is the opposite of that. It is a global scream. It is a display of dominance designed to terrify the survivors into submission. In many traditions, this is seen as a virtue, but let's be honest, you don't fear someone who is purely merciful. You fear someone who is unpredictable and capable of extreme violence. By including the flood in the sacred text, the writers were building a foundation of terror. It's the ultimate good cop, bad cop routine played by a single entity. For an agnostic or atheistic viewer, this looks less like divine justice and more like ancient propaganda used to keep a population in line. If you can convince people that the very rain from the sky is a weapon that can be turned against them at any moment, you have total control over their psychology. We also have to look at the mercy shown to Noah. Was it really mercy? He was forced to spend months in a floating box. When the boat finally hit land, he didn't walk out into a paradise. He walked out into a graveyard. If that is what salvation looks like, it's a very grim prize. It reminds me of the way some people talk about surviving a war. They don't feel blessed. They feel haunted. The God of Genesis 7 didn't just kill the bad people. He scarred the good ones forever. Let's get into the logic of wickedness. The Bible says that every thought of man's heart was only evil continually. That is a very bold, sweeping statement. In any population of millions of people, you have a spectrum. You have the cruel, yes, but you also have the kind, the confused, the disabled, and the young. It is a dehumanizing narrative. It's the same language used in every genocide in human history. Those people are all bad. They are all a virus. And the only way to save the world is to get rid of them. When humans say it, we recognize it as evil. When the text says God did it, we are told to call it mercy. This is the core of the intellectual struggle. If we look at the timeline, the flood was supposed to be a once-and-for-all solution. But look at the world today, or even the world a few hundred years after Noah. Violence, war, greed, and suffering didn't go away. So, if the violent method didn't solve the problem of human nature, then the loss of life in Genesis 7 was essentially for nothing. It was a massive sacrifice that failed to achieve its stated goal. In medicine, if a doctor tries a radical, painful surgery, and the patient dies anyway, or the disease comes back immediately, we question the doctor's judgment. We don't call the surgery a merciful attempt. We call it a failure. The story also assumes that death is the only way to deal with sin. This is a very primitive way of thinking. As humans have evolved, we have moved toward rehabilitation, education, and addressing the root causes of behavior. We recognize that people are often products of their environment. If God is the ultimate intelligence, why was his only tool a hammer? Why not provide a better environment? Why not provide better guidance? The fact that the all-powerful creator couldn't think of a way to fix humanity without killing everyone suggests that the story was written by people who couldn't imagine a world without vengeance. They projected their own violent tendencies onto their concept of the divine. In the end, the rainbow in the sky isn't a symbol of hope. It's a symbol of a ceasefire. It's a reminder that the weapon is still there. God just promised not to use that specific one again. It doesn't say he won't use fire, or famine, or plague. It just says, no more floods. It's like a bully promising not to use his left hand to hit you anymore. It doesn't make him a peaceful person. It just defines the limits of his next outburst. When you really sit with these arguments, you realize that Genesis 7 isn't a story about a merciful God. It's a story about the ancient struggle to explain why bad things happen to people, and the desperate attempt to blame those bad things on justice rather than the indifferent chaos of nature. By turning a natural disaster into a moral judgment, the authors of Genesis created a narrative that has been used to justify fear and blind obedience for millennia. But for those of us looking back with the benefit of logic, science, and a modern understanding of empathy, the violent method remains an indefensible stain on the concept of mercy. When we step back and look at the cultural legacy of this story, we have to consider the God of the Gaps problem. In the ancient world, people didn't have a grasp of meteorology, plate tectonics, or the water cycle. If a massive localized flood destroyed their village, it was easier to believe it was a purposeful act of a deity than to accept that nature is often indifferent to human life. By attributing the violence of the flood to a merciful reason, ancient societies created a sense of order out of chaos. They preferred a terrifying God who was in control over a world where things just happened for no reason. For a modern atheistic audience, this is a clear example of how humans use narrative to cope with a lack of control. We would rather be guilty in the eyes of a judge than unlucky in a random universe. Genesis 7 is the ultimate expression of this psychological defense mechanism, turning a terrifying natural event into a moral lesson, even if that lesson requires us to abandon our basic logical standards for what mercy actually looks like. There is also the heavy burden of original sin that this story reinforces. The flood implies that the very nature of humanity is so fundamentally flawed that it can only be washed away by blood and water. This is a very dark view of our species. If you tell a child they are born wicked and only escaped destruction because of a divine whim, you are setting the stage for a lifetime of shame and dependency. A truly merciful being would surely seek to empower his creation, to help them grow and learn from their mistakes, rather than keeping them in a state of perpetual debt for their own survival. The violent method teaches us that we are inherently unworthy, which is a powerful tool for religious control but a devastating blow to the human spirit. It suggests that our value is not intrinsic, but is entirely dependent on whether we can please a being whose standards for justice involve the elimination of almost everything that moves. Finally, we have to look at the mercy of the silent God during the event itself. According to the text, the rain fell for 40 days and the waters rose for months. This wasn't a quick or painless end. It was a prolonged, agonizing experience for every living thing involved. If mercy is the desire to alleviate suffering, then the mechanics of the flood are the literal antithesis of mercy. There is no mention of God comforting the dying or providing a quick exit for the innocent. There is only the rain, the rising tide, and the eventual silence. When we compare this to any modern ethical framework, the gap is massive. We wouldn't even treat a stray animal with that level of calculated coldness. By examining Genesis 7 without the lens of forced reverence, we see a story that reflects the harsh, brutal world of the people who wrote it, rather than the actions of a being who is supposedly the source of all love. It stands as a reminder that the stories we inherit shape our view of what is just, and it's up to us to decide if those ancient definitions still hold any weight in a world that values empathy and reason.